Cheers, guys. Epyx911, welcome to the Elitist Geek. Friday. Thank God it's Friday. My favorite day of the week. Well, the part after 3 where I'm driving home from work. A bit of a rant tonight. I had a previous video where I talked about early access gaming. What I like about it, which isn't much. What I hate about it, actually a lot. But I don't think I ever really got my point across because I was quite frankly just too pissed off and I kind of went on a tangent. I'm going to try to sum it up a little better in some areas and dive down a little more in depth in others. There was an article online which talked about early access games. The reason it came to mind again is a Steam game called Towns. This was a game that thousands of people paid for, got greenlit on Steam, and then basically one dev quit and the guy who took over for him, he quit as well, citing burnout and the inability to make day-to-day expenses, cover day-to-day expenses. Fair fucking enough, all right? You pay into early access games, there's going to be risks. And that's definitely one of them, the developer stopping. But what I want to get at is what specifically this is going to do. In the article, positives were listed. All right? And one of the positives, and I'm looking at the article right now, is that early access helps fund the development of indie games. And this is Kotaku.com, by the way, for anyone who's interested. I'll link the article below. That early access helps fund the development of indie games. Fair enough. That's true. I agree with that point. Moving on. It involves the fans in the development process. Again, I can't disagree with that. I think there's better ways to go about that. Indiegogo or Kickstarter, for example. And they're certainly not perfect either. It gives games under development more publicity. Again, I can't argue with that. Absolutely. Unfortunately, it can also do the reverse. It can give you a lot of negative publicity, which I suppose is also a good thing because hopefully it prevents developers from basically pulling a fucking Derek Smart Battlecruiser 3000 AD, shitting the bed, and then fucking leaving Dodge. And anybody who's an older gamer like me who's lived through the Battlecruiser 3000 debacle, you'll know what I'm talking about. And if you haven't, read up on it. It's a pretty interesting saga. And the final good point they have, the final positive, is that early access lets you play the game immediately. That's what I want to explore a little bit more. Lets you play the game immediately. I'm going to have to disagree with that. It lets you see aspects of the game immediately. But a lot of these early access games are not even fucking finished. You're not playing the game. You are testing the game. And I know that's the beef that got me in trouble with some people, but hear me out on this. Every programming developer for AAA titles has a quality assurance department. It's the job of the quality assurance department to take the pre-alphas, alphas, betas, release candidates, and test them. And testing is drastically different than playing. When I worked at Electronic Arts Canada in Burnaby here, I get friends all the time and family. Oh my God, you work at Electronic Arts. You get paid to play games. And this was a job I had when I just finished my university, comp science. So it was kind of my first IT job. And I'd be like, no, 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 you guys don't understand. And quite frankly, I could have, and I did, speak till I was red in the face. They don't get it. But here's the difference. When you test a game, you're doing everything from, sure, some fun stuff to legitimately, painfully, monotonously boring aspects of the game. Stat checking, finding crash bugs, doing monotonously boring things like sports game, for example, FIFA Road to the World Cup. One of the tasks I had, and I still recall it, is to go through every single player on every team, on every roster, make sure that the names, the stats, everything is correct, but also try to find game bugs that are dependent on those characters. So you're navigating menus, never mind even getting into gameplay. And I remember I had that task for weeks on end. Suffice it to say, when we got to the end of a project and got our free copy, most of us ran to Electronics Boutique / GameStop as quickly as we could to turn those games in, because you didn't want to fucking actually play it because you tested it. You write up the bugs, the developers fix the bugs. And how this works with most game companies is games will launch with bugs in them. Of course, we know that. That's a no-brainer. We know that in the PC industry. Games have lots of bugs. But I'm talking about bugs that everything from minor cosmetic stuff to massive showstoppers, if the showstopper bug is so rare and hard to recreate that they deem it's not going to be problematic for release. It'll ship with that. So most of these games to this day on autopilot, I can crash them within seconds. Released games, fully patched, I can still crash them. To me, that is exactly what early access is. Early access games, you're really testing the build to date. You're not doing much playing. You're not as structured as a software tester and quality assurance department. Granted, agreed, no argument there. But you certainly take on an element of that because things are still going to be broken in the game. And whether that's Wasteland 2, your triple or your double single A titles, or your triple A titles, your Call of Duties, etc., etc., there are going to be bugs. There needs to be a structure in place. All right. Might and Magic 10 Legacy, that was a game that I bought in on early access, and yeah, it was pretty hideous. There were lots of bugs, but I knew right away to pull out after the early access. To me, was more a donation to help the devs, knowing full well that they may or may not finish the game. Thankfully they did, and I didn't spoil it for myself. And I think that's the other problem with what I have with this good point about early access letting you play the game immediately is you could tire of the game in the pre-release format and not even have seen the final version. You'll just be so sick of the game. That's a real possibility. It could happen. Now, what about some of the points that they deemed as being terrible? It can create a poor impression of a game. Absolutely. I just touched on that. You see a game in its unready state, and it can do a couple of things to you. It can make you appreciate how far a dev has come, but it can also do the reverse of that. It can make you realize how poor, unmotivated, and poorly driven some devs are as well. Especially when you see cosmetic things months later in a released copy of the game that weren't fixed. The other point, we're paying money for an unfinished, broken product. Agreed. And here's where I'll clarify. It depends on what your intention is. If it was like me, donation, fair enough. If you agree to take that risk up front, fair enough. But if you are buying it, one of the things we got to remember is the more people that do this, the more likely this trend is to continue. And the question you have to ask is, do the negatives outweigh the positives, or the positives the negatives? And I think early access, the negatives far outweigh the positives. I think it's going to put money into people's pockets that may not be that driven, that could come out of this less driven and less likely to finish their game. Absolutely. So paying money for an unfinished broken product, I don't mind paying money for a game once it's fixed, if it's additional content, but to help beta test, right? To help beta test a game and to pay for that, well, they should actually be paying us or making it a free beta, in my opinion. Next point. Early access can be easily abused. The developer could just take your money and run. Absolutely. And I touched on that already. The trailer and features listed aren't always accurate. Now, Dark Souls 2 was not an early access game, but it is a good case in point for trailers of a game not accurately portraying the final release of the game. Dark Souls 2 had a much better lighting engine. It had a higher polygon count and better textures in the trailers. The gameplay footage that we saw last summer. The final release didn't look near as good. There's not much incentive to update, finish developing a game as another point, and agreed, and I talked about that as well. You kill the motivation because they already have your money. There's not much incentive to fix issues before early access. Agreed, and that's huge. That's a huge point. Large companies are joining the early access bandwagon, and that right there is where I have the biggest fucking issue. I almost don't mind indies. I don't mind smaller development houses because it's a boost of revenue for them. But larger companies, there's almost no need for them to go this route. Or switching to this route, almost like a bait and switch tactic. I loved Interplay. I like In Exile. I'm a huge Brian Fargo fan. I loved Wasteland. I spent $350 for the Kickstarter campaign. I have a huge problem with Wasteland 2 being early access because to me, they'd already gone the funding route. And then to ask for additional funding, that's just not right. It's not right. Finish the game with the funding you have from the Kickstarter. Deliver that. Make your third game take those extra features into account. And I love me a meaty, bulky game. But the problem is to me, it smacks of the dev poorly funding the game. Almost like the Double Fine Productions. You know, Tim's baby there. The way they ended up kind of splitting the project up, they had overspent and overpromised and underdelivered. And they realized it, unfortunately, too late. And I think early access caters to that. And that's a dangerous, dangerous thing. Of course, I forgive Brian Fargo and In Exile. And of course, I'm still looking forward to Wasteland 2. But I am nervous as fuck, and I do not agree with their decision to have gone early access with it. 100% against it. Early access can eventually be the norm. And I thought that's a perfect way to kind of finish the video because that is the huge danger in this. Indies will quickly be weeded out if they do this and they burn their goodwill. They likely will have just, a 1 or 2 strike policy. The problem is once the AAA companies start going down this route, we are going to have another microtransaction style fad because every developer and their cousin is going to want to try to go through that model. And for all the negatives that I pointed out, that game risks being an inferior product that it otherwise might have been had it gone the other routes. Really curious to hear what you guys think on this, and You guys like the video, hit like. If you you don't like it, you hit dislike, obviously. But I'd like to hear from you if you dislike the video. Hell, I'd like to hear from you if you like it as well. Let me know. Let's get some dialogue going. Let me know what you didn't like. Was I not clear on the message? Do you just not agree with me? It's one of the things with the dislike button in YouTube is you never know why. And of course, if you're just being an ass, whatever, there's nothing I can do about that, or anybody can do about that. But if you have a genuine beef, I just think it would be so much more productive for the conversation to list why. And hit subscribe if you like this video. You want to see more stuff like this. I do video game reviews, anime, playthroughs, tech talk, vlogs, and random kind of babbling / venting like this. As always, cheers, guys.